examining parallels between the historical and contemporary context of Indigenous education. My name is Michael Cautery. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Hawaii at Manoa and Assistant Professor of Education and Teaching at the University of Hawaii Leeward Community College. My role as an educator is in the diverse and marginalized context. It is to support Native Hawaiians and other represented groups interested in entering the teaching profession. It is with a great deal of respect for social justice in the marginalized context. It is with a critical frame of theory and an empowerment frame of practice. It is to interrogate dominant ideology in education. It is to empower my students by supporting identity development, consciousness of powerful structures of education, awareness and proficiency in diverse pedagogies, and a demonstration of ethical consideration for both student and context. In this case, I present Native American boarding schools in relationship to Hawaii public schools. Schools are often naively perceived as a good thing and as a source of social amelioration, but this is not always the case. Historically speaking, Native American boarding schools are one example where students from indigenous contexts have been oppressed as a result of political and social actors who perceive them to be a problem. In order to explore this context, we need the power of a critical lens focused on the ideology at their foundations. Retroactively, I hope to respect the individuals and communities that have experienced oppressive education in the marginalized context by learning what we can from their suffering and triumph. I'll share with you my framework of the examination. Ball says that we need critical discourse analysis that confronts invisible and insidious practices. We need to analyze symbolic forms because these provide historical and social links to the ideology at their foundations. These forms include films, portraits, photographs, books, practices, and public and everyday linguistic utterances. We should be concerned about how they serve to establish and sustain relations of domination. Part 3. The ideology in the boarding school context. Ideology in the boarding school context goes all the way back to John Locke's second treatise and the lesser-known Fundamental Constitutions of Carolina, in which he claims the virtues of private property, individualism, and the Christian ethic. Meanwhile, he's asserting that Indians are merely ignorant heathens. We see a genealogy of government policy that includes the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, the Indian Removal Act of 1830, Worcester v. Georgia in 1832, the Homestead Act of 1862, Indians Appropriations Act in 1871, and the Dawes Severalty Act in 1887. We also know that manifest destiny is a common conceptual doxa from the time period, to which John O'Sullivan said, "The far-reaching, the boundless future will be an era of American greatness. In its magnificent domain of space and time, the nation of many nations is destined to manifest to mankind the excellence of divine principles, to establish on earth the noblest temple ever dedicated to the worship of the Most High, the sacred, and the true. Its floor shall be a hemisphere, its roof the firmament of a star-studded heavens, and its congregation and union of many republics, comprising hundreds of happy millions, calling, owning no man master." Here we see an example of a picture of a button from the Office of Indian Affairs from the 1880s. We notice a rising sun, a homestead house, and a man working a field with a plow, and references to God, and he helps those who work. Here we see a painting from John Gass entitled American Progress, in which we see in the left buffalo and Indian and wild animals, and also darkness. And as we move to the right, we notice wagons, settlers, and the Lady of Progress, carrying with her a text, whether that be a Bible or a school book, in her angelic form, bringing progress. Within the boarding schools, they had very specific policy. One of the men who was most prominent was the headmaster of Carlisle Institute, Richard Henry Pratt. His most resounding statement of the era came in the form of "kill the Indian and save the man." He believed that schooling will destroy the wicked Indian and save the good soul. He believed that they are conducting the work of immersing the Indian in our civilization, and when we get them under, holding them there until they are thoroughly soaked. This illuminates the ideology or the imagery of a baptism. Thomas J. Morgan, Commissioner of Indian Affairs, was perhaps the most systematic in his approach to bring accountability to the Native American boarding school. He believed it should be uniform and it should be immediate in order to rid the U.S. of this native barbarian. In order to do so, he would attack them with education that would destroy their land, culture, and identity. Of Morgan's 13 explicit tenets, we can synthesize them into primarily compulsory schooling for private neoliberal citizens, compulsory schooling for official divine and Western knowledge, and compulsory schooling that would be systematically accountable to science. We recognize many procedural displays of success. These are annual events in which they speak to the data and the progress and the proficiency of their methods. Here we notice a Regina Indian residential school student from 1874. Indian boarding schools claim to transform the savage into civilized citizens. These photographs represent annual procedural displays around notions of student data and proficiency. They were used to demonstrate how you could take a heathen and convert them into a classic citizen. They were done on a very mass scale. And they included schools' attempts to Christianize the Native American. And this led to identity crisis in students. For example, one student from the late 1800s said, "I believe in education because I believe it will kill the Indian that is in me and leave the man and the citizen. I contradict the statement that only good Indian is a dead Indian. The only good Indian is an educated Indian." And so you can see here as the student begins to reiterate the rhetoric of the policy. Similarly, Andrew Windyboy said, "When I arrived, they cut off my hair. Everybody made fun of me. Then when I did nothing because of the shame, teachers would hit me. When I did something, they would hit me everywhere. Whenever I talked Cree, would come out. Whenever I would talk, I would get hit. I got hit so much I lost my tongue. When I got home, my father cried. He talked to me in Cree and I did not understand. The only thing I could remember was my name." And you can see how the photographs don't tell the story from the perspective of the student. So we have a little bit of gross political humor that connects the context of Native American boarding school to that of Hawaii as a colonial context. We see here, as Uncle Sam is educating students from the islands, one of them being Hawaii, while the students of previous colonized peoples are in the back. And the blackboard reads, "The consent of the governed is a good thing in theory, but very rare in fact. England has governed her colonies, whether they were consented or not. By not waiting for their consent, she has greatly advanced the world's civilization. The U.S. must govern its new territories with or without the consent of the governed until they can govern themselves." Similarly, here in a cartoon entitled The American Policy, we notice Irish and African American students at the doorway to Liberty School, while we have Native American students in front of the teacher, while a Hawaiian student in Western dress waits behind in the wings as Uncle Sam drags a Native child towards the school. So this brings us to the parallel. If we overlay these ideas, whether that's the ideology or the practices of procedural displays, or the curriculum that is chosen from the tenets of Thomas Morgan, we can see some interesting parallels. We notice that, for example, Hawaii public schools, and in particular schools serving Native Hawaiians, are the target of reform and corrective action. Currently, 76% of predominantly Native Hawaiian schools are in restructuring, and over 55% of Native Hawaiian students attend a school that is in restructuring as a result of No Child Left Behind. We see the genealogy of contemporary U.S. education policy revealing its normative, conservative, nationalist, and neoliberal ideology that aligns with ideological and political rhetoric framing Indian boarding schools. These include the Defense of Education Act in 1958, the ESEA Act in 1965, IDEA in 1975, National Policy Document Nation at Risk in 1983, Goals 2000 in 1994, No Child Left Behind in 2001, American Recovery and Reinvestment Act in 2009, and the Race to the Top in 2009. All of these education policies are interested in the education of the other. If we examine some of the political rhetoric surrounding the context, Eisenhower said we need to strengthen our American system of education so that it can meet the broad and increasing demands imposed on it by basic considerations of national security. Lyndon B. Johnson, responsible for the Great Society, said, "My Attorney General tells me that it is legal and constitutional to sign this act on a Sunday, even on Palm Sunday. My minister assured me that the Lord's Day will not be violated by making into law a measure which brings mental and moral benefit to millions of young people." Reagan asked, "Are we doing enough of a job teaching our children what America is and what she represents?" Those of us who are over 35 or so were taught very directly what it means to be an American. Our spirit is back, but we haven't reinstitutionalized it. I'm warning of an eradication of the American memory that could result in the erosion of the American spirit. George Bush ushered in No Child Left Behind in 2001, and he believed accountability is incredibly important for our school systems. People shouldn't fear accountability. They ought to welcome the accountability system as a useful tool to make sure no child is left behind. Obama believed education is essential to rebuilding our economy. And Arne Duncan believed, today we cross a threshold in education reform. Race to the top is the educational equivalent of the moonshot. And I am full of hope for America's transformational change. Now is our time. Well, the interesting thing about Race to the Top is you can see this transition from ideology to political rhetoric to the policy. Race to the Top is arguably a neoliberal, neoconservative, and normative behavioral mechanism of accountability that mirrors Morgan's tenets. These include the idea of college and career readiness for workforce participation and economic development. Additionally, and similar to the Indian boarding schools, Race to the Top supports universal Common Core standards in relationship to the fidelity to research and science-based curriculum. This is faithfully delivered by an accountability system run by managerial classes who are steering from a distance. This managerial class goes through similar procedures of display in which it constructs a limited view of students from the raw data gathered by universal standardized testing. Additionally, teachers are controlled for with evaluations tied to these outcomes which influence and impact their pay. Here we recognize a very interesting procedural display similar to some from the boarding school Aera, in which we have a colonial actor with local students in uniform. So I think this brings me to the idea that we require additional research into this area. I've really constructed just a theoretical argument in which we develop some of the parallels. We need to go deeper and do a more thorough discourse analysis in connecting the language of Native American boarding schools to the policies of Race to the Top. I believe that we continue to need more research on neoliberalism's deployment of normative accountability structure. We need to employ a critique from within the logic of behavioral sciences, thereby providing the notion that neoliberalism and normative structure neglect agency and context. If we find that normative procedures of accountability are nonsensible in indigenous contexts, I will argue that we need a greater understanding of divergent rationales and supportive methods of instruction, and specifically within the processes of contextualization. In order to examine where in teacher practice we find evidence of rationalization and contextualization, I propose that we study teachers' choices for the curriculum and instruction and the practices they use to rationalize and contextualize knowledge in the classroom. This is in order to develop a more nuanced connection between the ideology and the practice, and what I will attempt to construct as the rationality of teacher discourse.